Boldwood presents Autumn Dreams at Mermaids Point, written by Sarah Bennett and read by Annabel Inge. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. July. Ah, Gareth, you should see the way he makes her smile. It's like a light comes on inside her. Nerissa closed her eyes for a moment, picturing her niece Laurie as she'd seen her in the pub the previous evening, head tilted as she listened to whatever Jake was whispering in her ear. It had been a rare night out for the whole family, a chance to welcome Jake's mother to Mermaids Point and introduce her around. Nerissa still wasn't sure what to make of Linda. She wasn't at all convinced it was a good thing for Jake to have her back in his life, especially when his relationship with Laurie was still finding its feet. But she'd held her peace until now. Shifting to ease the ache in her hip from sitting cross-legged on the ground too long, Nerissa confessed her doubts to the one person she was always able to speak her heart to. Honestly, Gar, she's such a mousy thing. It's a struggle to make even the most basic conversation. I don't think Linda's had an opinion of her own all her life. She sighed, knowing she was being unfair, given the little her sister-in-law Sylvia had told her about what both Jake and his mother had been through over the years. At least she's free of that awful man now. Given time, she might come out of her shell a bit more. If anyone can help her, it'll be Sylvia. Nerissa loved her sister-in-law with all her heart, but she knew from personal experience what Sylvia was like once she found a pet project. Glancing down at the bunch of sunny yellow daffodils in her hand, Nerissa gave a small laugh. With any luck, she'll be so busy with Linda, she won't have time to try to fix me up with anyone for a bit. I don't know why she's still bothering after all these years. She rearranged the bouquet to release one of the golden trumpet flowers which had twisted at an odd angle. Other women might prefer roses or extravagant lilies, but daffodils had been Nerissa's favourite since the first time Gareth had turned up on her doorstep. Tanned and fit after weeks of basic training, he'd presented her with a bunch of daffodils, a nervous smile tugging at his gorgeous full lips. He'd kissed her for the first time that day, down by the caves on the beach where he'd taken her for a walk. He'd told her he loved her that day too, that he was tired of waiting for her to notice him, that she was his girl now, forever. She raised her free hand and pressed it to the echo of the warm glow that had heated her cheeks when he'd said those words. She'd been noticing her brother's best friend from the moment he'd picked her up and brushed gravel off her knees when she tripped over by the swings in the park. He'd been 11 to her 7 and had interrupted a noisy kickabout with her brother and the rest of their pals to set her back on her feet and wipe away her tears with the sleeve of his sweatshirt. Her heart had been his from that moment on, though of course she'd been too young to understand or articulate anything beyond the feelings of security and happiness she felt whenever he was near. Those fledgling feelings had developed into a full-blown crush once her hormones caught up with her heart. Her early teens had been an excruciating torture of unspoken adoration and blushes whenever he popped over to the Morgan family home, which had been practically every day, especially during the holidays. When he'd announced at 21 that a life on the fishing boats wasn't for him and he was off to join the army, the scandal of it had rushed around the village like wildfire. Nerissa had lain on her bed and wept silent tears into her pillow, thinking him lost to her forever. And then he'd come home on leave to reveal those messy, wonderful things she'd been feeling for him weren't unrequited after all. Swallowing around the tight ball in her throat, Nerissa laid the daffodils on the square of neatly clipped grass in front of the plain white headstone. "I love you, Gareth," she whispered, touching her fingers to her lips before pressing them to the engraved letters of his name. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." Rising to her feet, Nerissa turned away before the first tear dripped down her cheek. Gareth had always hated to see her cry, and though it had been over 20 years since he'd last been able to brush them from her cheeks, she still didn't like to do it here in the little graveyard behind the parish church where he'd been laid to rest after a road accident during a peacekeeping mission in the Balkans. Such a waste of a life, of the promise of their life, their future together. She clutched the diamond and sapphire ring dangling from a chain around her neck, squeezing it until the imprint of the stones hurt. She'd taken it off when the band had grown too tight, but hadn't been able to let it go, to let Gareth go. With the ghosts of memories they'd never share swirling around in her mind, Nerissa ducked her head and hurried along the path to the lich gate guarding the entrance to the churchyard. So fixated was she on the past, she didn't notice the woman coming the other way until they were practically on top of one another. Nerissa? The lack of inflection in the word sent a chill rippling down Nerissa's spine. "Hello, Margot. How are you?" She winced the moment the stupid automatic words left her lips. The death of the man they'd both loved above all others could have brought them together in solace and mutual grief, if only Gareth's mother had been willing. She'd never forgiven Nerissa for him joining the army, even though it had been a decision he'd made on his own. Gareth had told his mum of his plans for a future with Nerissa before he'd said so much as a word to her. In Margot's mind, it was therefore Nerissa's fault he'd quit the boats and left the village in hopes of giving them both a better, brighter future. 2 decades had hardened that initial, irrational, if understandable need to blame someone for the loss of Margot's son into a lasting bitterness. Desperate for a way to cut through the frigid atmosphere between them, Nerissa nodded to the enormous bouquet of white lilies and roses Margot carried. "Those are nice." "They're the ones I always get, the same as for his funeral." Margot didn't meet her eyes, every stiff inch of her posture radiating a fervent desire for Nerissa to go away. Not that she'd ever say as much, because Margot's disdain was as polite as it was cold. Nerissa wished just once she'd let it all out, scream and rail and call curses down upon her head. Perhaps if Margot could give voice to all that resentment, she could finally let it go, instead of allowing it to consume her from the inside out. Holding back a sigh, Nerissa took a step back and to the side, clearing a path for the other woman to pass through the lich gate. "I'll leave you in peace, Margot. You know where I am if you ever need anything." The only response was the sharp click of Margot's heels on the path as she strode away. Shaking her head, Nerissa passed beneath the roof of the gate, trying not to think about that awful rainy day when the pallbearers had paused beneath it with Gareth's coffin on their shoulders as they marked the symbolic passage of his life from this world to the next. Margot was never going to change, and it was way past time for Nerissa to stop trying. As she paused at the curb to check for passing cars, she knew it was a fruitless thought. It wasn't in her nature to let someone hurt if she could help it. With that in mind, she changed direction and headed the opposite way to her niece's pretty seafront cafe, which had been her intended destination. Both Laurie and Sylvia were waiting for her there, with hugs that would ease the ache in her heart, and a slice of her favourite Victoria sponge to lift her spirits. As much as she needed that right now, there was someone who needed it more. After a couple of weeks holed up in Sylvia's spare room, Linda had recently rented one of the small holiday cottages in the centre of the village, while she tried to decide if she wanted to make a more permanent move to Mermaids Point. With a little coaxing, perhaps Nerissa could get her to join her for a walk on the beach and onto the cafe, where they would both find a warm welcome. Though her beloved Gareth had been nothing like the awful bully Linda had been tied to for years, she understood loss better than most. So she would extend the hand of friendship and offer what comfort she could to the recently widowed woman. And just maybe, they'd both feel a little better afterwards. Chapter 2. When she reached the old fisherman's cottage, Nerissa lifted the heavy iron knocker and rapped hard a couple of times and waited. And waited. Stepping back on the pavement, she raised a hand to shield her eyes and studied the windows. The upstairs curtains were pulled closed, which wasn't all that surprising, as they were catching the full force of the summer sun, but the downstairs curtains were also drawn shut behind the lacy nets which shielded the windows from nosy passers-by. A movement at what Nerissa knew to be the lounge window caught her eye. Was Linda in there? Or had the breeze stirred the curtains through the horizontal upper window, which had been opened to its fullest extent? Feeling a bit awkward, Nerissa checked around her to make sure no one was watching her snooping, then went to stand directly beneath the opening. The muffled sounds of a television show drifted out. Nerissa strained her ears, trying to pick up any indication of Linda moving around. The sound changed abruptly, the music switching from a romantic melody to a thumping beat. Nerissa waited another minute, and it switched again to the sound of two men arguing, followed by a rapid burst of gunfire which made her jump. Pressing a hand to her racing heart, Nerissa laughed to herself as she realised it was a rolling stream of programme previews. Linda must have gone out and left the television on. She might even be at the cafe already. Nerissa was about to turn away when soft sobs reached her ears. Maybe it was coming from the television? Stretching on tiptoe to get closer to the window, she recognised a comedy series she'd recently binge-watched. The sobbing came again, sounding totally out of place against the snappy dialogue. "Linda?" Nerissa called, keeping her voice soft. "Are you there?" The sobs cut off immediately as the television in the background rolled through to another preview. Legs aching, Nerissa dropped down to her heels for a moment before stretching back up to the open window. "Linda, it's Nerissa. Is everything all right?" A long silence, then a strained, terse reply. "Go away." "Sorry, I just wondered if you fancied joining me down at the cafe." More silence. "Okay, well, hopefully we'll catch up soon. Give me a call, any time." Embarrassed at herself for prying, Nerissa abandoned her spot beneath the window and turned away, pulling out her phone as she started to walk back the way she'd come. She fired off a quick WhatsApp message to Sylvia. "On my way. Just called to see if Linda wanted to join us, and I think she's crying. Can't tell as she won't answer the door, but she told me to go away. Sad face." An instant later, the word typing appeared at the top of the screen, followed shortly by a reply. "Did you try the front door?" Nerissa stopped on the pavement to tap out a sharp response. "No, I left the poor woman to it. I already feel bad for snooping around under the window." Typing. "Go back and see if the door is open. Those old cottages have a latch that works from the outside." Of course, Sylvia would know that. She seemed to know everything about everything in the point. As though sensing Nerissa's hesitancy, Sylvia sent a follow-up message. "Just try the door, Nair. We can't leave her on her own if she's upset." Against her better judgment, Nerissa retraced her steps. The front window was now closed, the curtains still drawn tightly. "This is a big mistake," she muttered under her breath, as she reached for the old-fashioned metal latch and pressed her thumb to it. When it clunked down, Nerissa took a deep breath and forced herself to nudge open the door. "Linda, I'm so sorry to intrude," she said, as she stepped onto the stone flags of the hallway floor and edged the door closed behind her. "I just want to make sure you're okay, and then I promise I'll go away and leave you in peace." Stepping into the darkened interior of the front room, Nerissa's gaze flickered over the array of dirty cups and plates on the table, past the small pile of crumpled tissues on the sofa cushion, and met Linda's reddened eyes. Her mousy hair hung limp around her face, and the thickness of the seam on the sleeve of the cardigan she was huddled into suggested she had pulled it on inside out. Moving cautiously, the way one might around a skittish animal, Nerissa made her way to the nearby armchair and sat down. With the window closed, the heat was stifling, but Linda didn't appear to notice. Reaching out, Nerissa pressed the mute button on the remote control, cutting off a canned laughter track. Tension settled, as thick and unpleasant as the air. "Is there anything I can get for you?" Nerissa asked, hoping a neutral question might help her ease her way into the conversation. "I told you to go away." Linda punctuated the words with a noisy blow of her nose into a sodden-looking tissue. Nerissa leaned forward and nudged the Kleenex box on the table nearer to Linda. "I thought you might have learned from the way Sylvia and the rest of the family invaded your home that us Morgans aren't very good at minding our own business." When Linda's husband, Nigel, had died unexpectedly 6 weeks previously, their son Jake had gone home for the first time in 10 years to deal with the fallout. Unwilling to let him handle things on his own, the Morgan clan, minus Nerissa, had descended uninvited to help him manage the arrangements and to try and get Linda back on her feet a bit. It had seemed like she was making progress, and they'd all hoped to stay in the Point might give Linda a bit of breathing space and a chance to make some decisions about her future without being surrounded by constant reminders of what she'd lost. From the state of both Linda and the little cottage, those hopes were misplaced. True. Linda gave just the glimmer of what might have been a smile, and Nerissa felt her shoulders relax. If you really want me to go away, I will, Nerissa promised, but at least let me get you a cup of tea or a cold drink first. Silence stretched long enough for the knot of tension in Nerissa's shoulders to return, and she was about to get up when Linda sighed and said, "There's some sparkling water in the fridge." Nerissa took her time fetching them both a drink, giving Linda a minute or two to collect herself. Once she'd set the glasses on the coffee table, Nerissa circled the sofa and tugged open the curtains a couple of inches to let in a little bit of light, and propped the upper window back open. By the time she retook her seat, Linda's face was dry, and she was holding the cool glass against one cheek. After a sip of her own water to wet her lips, Nerissa took a breath and hoped she could find the right words. Grief is a funny thing, and it doesn't come with any rules. When Linda remained silent, she stumbled on. I lost someone very special to me. It was a long time ago now, but some days are harder than others. It would have been his birthday today. I'm sorry for your loss. When Nerissa glanced across, it was to find Linda's attention was fixed on her rather than her glass. Thank you. Like I said, it was a long time ago. I just wanted you to know that I understand some of what you're going through. Do you? Linda's laugh was harsh and bitter. I don't expect you do at all. Startled, Nerissa took another sip of her water to cover her shock at the ugliness in Linda's tone. Well, of course, everyone's experience is different. Gareth and I had barely a year together. Not a lifetime shared like you and Nigel. And you loved him? Oof. Those 4 words and the untold story they hid all but stole the breath from Nerissa's lungs. Wishing like hell she'd ignored Sylvia's urgings and carried on her way to the cafe, Nerissa braced herself for another peek beneath the lid of the Pandora's box she'd inadvertently opened. From the little bits Laurie has told me, I understand Nigel could be difficult. Difficult? Linda laughed that bitter laugh again. Bloody impossible, more like. Her head turned sharply away, as though she hadn't meant to uncork the bottle of repressed feelings, and didn't know how to stop her it again before she said any more. Nerissa didn't blame her. She wasn't at all sure she was the right person for Linda to be talking to about this, but then again, who was? Poor Jake had enough on his plate coming to terms with his own grief, not that he'd shown a flicker of emotion. Well, maybe things were different when he and Laurie were alone, but when he was around the rest of the family, it was as if he'd shrugged it off and was determined to focus only on the future. Nerissa didn't blame him for that either. Perhaps if she'd done a bit more of that, she wouldn't be suspended as she was in a life half-lived. Her hand hovered at the base of her throat, drawn once more to the engagement ring she hadn't worn long enough to develop a tan line on her finger. No, she couldn't do anything to help Jake, but Linda was a different matter. Tell me. Linda's shoulders slumped, her body curling in upon itself. He was so charming when we met. I was 16, and it was the first time I'd been allowed to go to the Apple Blossom Fair without my parents. I went with a little gang of pals from school. Nigel and his friends were a bit older, and they pushed in the queue with us just as we got to the Dodgems. Somehow they split us up, and I ended up riding in the car with him. She raised her glass and gulped at her water like a survivor crawling out of the desert, not stopping until its contents were drained. God forgive me for saying so, but sitting down in that bloody bumper car was the worst mistake of my life. given everything that's happened, I don't think anyone would blame you for feeling that way. In the darkest, quietest moments of the past 20 years, Nerissa had wished Gareth had never shown up on her doorstep. Linda's next words were barely above a whisper. But then I wouldn't have Jake. And what kind of woman, what kind of mother wishes away a life that gave them a child? Regretting your life with Nigel and wishing Jake away aren't the same thing, Nerissa responded in a fierce voice, furious with the dead stranger who'd tied Linda up in so many Gordian knots. He'd have been better off without us, Linda muttered. Reaching across the narrow coffee table, Nerissa grabbed Linda's limp hand and gave it a hard shake. Look at me. It took a few moments, but when their eyes finally met, Nerissa tightened her grip. I'm not here to absolve you of guilt for past actions. That's something for you and Jake to sort out between yourselves. But you're free now to make your own decisions about how you move into the future. But that's the whole problem. I don't know how to make those kinds of decisions. Linda placed her empty glass on the table, then covered her face in her hands. Nigel did everything, and I went along with it. Her hands fell limply to her lap. I knew I'd made a terrible mistake within the first 6 months of our marriage, but when I spoke to my parents, they told me I'd made my bed and I had to lie in it. I don't think they really understood how difficult it was, or maybe I didn't explain it well enough. She glanced across at Nerissa. We weren't the sort of family that really talked about those sorts of things. Nerissa's heart ached for the woman. Nerissa had grown up in a boisterous, loving family, and though she was a bit more introverted than her older brother, she'd always had someone to talk to, someone who would listen. Yes, she'd been told a harsh truth a time or two by their mother, but she'd never been brushed off in the way it sounded like Linda had been. She wondered what her mum would have made of Linda's situation, and a wave of longing struck her. Mermaids Morgan had passed away 3 years ago, long enough to adjust to her not being around, but it was another hole in her life that felt too big. Focus. Giving herself a little mental shake, Nerissa rose from the armchair and rounded the coffee table to take a seat on the sofa beside Linda, taking her unresisting hand once more. I don't want you to feel under pressure to talk if you're not comfortable with it. Linda returned her touch with the tiniest of squeezes. You are kind. It's just another thing I don't know how to do. I feel useless, a waste of space. I shouldn't have come here. I'm a millstone around Jake's neck. I'm sure he doesn't feel that way, Nerissa said, not being entirely truthful, but Linda's confidence didn't seem like it would take another blow. But I understand you not wanting to feel like a burden to him. Why don't you let me help you? I know Sylvia would say the same if she were here. You're not on your own, Linda. We'd like to be your friends, if that's something you'd like too. Linda swallowed so hard Nerissa could see the bob in her throat. I don't know how to be a friend, not anymore. Nigel never wanted me to spend time with anyone other than him, even when he was at work. Oh, fuck Nigel. The two of them shared an equally shocked look before they both burst out laughing. I'm sorry, Nerissa gasped around her giggles. I shouldn't have said that. Linda raised her free hand to wipe the tears from the corners of her eyes. Yes, you should, and I should have too, a long time ago. Tilting her head back, she opened her mouth and yelled, Fuck you, Nigel Smith! Nerissa couldn't stop another snort of laughter escaping. Bravo! With a long sigh, Linda closed her eyes and her hand tightened around Nerissa's palm. Nerissa pressed back, giving what strength and support she could, and the time to process what must be a tumult of emotions. When Linda finally spoke, her words broke Nerissa's heart. I don't know who I am. You're free now, Linda. Free to be whoever you want to be. As she watched the other woman wipe away the last of her tears, Nerissa decided she needed to listen to her own advice. For too long she'd allowed the past to shackle her, allowed others to mould and shape her life instead of taking control. And she knew exactly where to start. She'd let Doc dither and delay over making a decision about his retirement for too long. As his live-in housekeeper cum receptionist, whatever decision he made would have a profound effect on the next chapter in her own life. The prospect of being both jobless and homeless at the age of 43 was frankly terrifying, which is why she'd let things drift. It felt hypocritical to sit here urging Linda to seize control of her destiny and not do the same. Her fingers rose to toy with the ring on her necklace. Change was coming for both of them, whether they liked it or not. Chapter 3. Max, sorry I'm late, guys. Tom Nelson tossed his keys onto the side table in the hall as he kicked the front door shut behind him with his heel. Silence greeted him, which wasn't unexpected these days. Tugging at his tie, Tom carried his medical bag into his study, tucked it into the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, and spun the combination lock. Not that he didn't trust the kids. They knew his study was strictly off-limits, but he'd been doing it since Emily had first started crawling. A memory of her as a chubby infant, all smiles and rolls of baby powder-scented sweetness sprung to mind, bringing a rare grin to his face, which was quickly wiped away by the continued silence to his greeting. He closed the door of his study, pausing to toe off his shoes in the hallway before padding towards the kitchen. "Max? Where are you?" he called again. "In here." The response when it came was in a much deeper voice than he'd expected. What was his brother doing here? Perplexed, Tom entered the room to find Alex stirring a bubbling pot on the stovetop. Max sat at the battered pine kitchen table, his head bent over something. Bracing himself for another one-sided conversation about his 12-year-old son's obsession with his phone, Tom was pleasantly surprised to realise Max was focused on his maths book. "Hey, Bud, where's your sister?" Tom bent over to press a kiss to the top of Max's tousled blonde hair. It was several weeks past needing a cut, and Tom added it to his mental to-do list. "Upstairs." The single-word response was followed by a long silence, and Tom wondered if the two of them had been fighting. They got along great for the most part, but perhaps today was one of those rare occasions when they'd butted heads. He tried a different tack. "How was school?" "Okay." Normally, the question would prompt a flood of information, terrible jokes Max had heard from one of his friends, and insistence Tom watch whatever the latest hilarious video was trending on TikTok, but not tonight. Tom rested a gentle hand on Max's shoulder. "Only okay?" Keeping his eyes fixed on his book, Max bobbed his head up and down. Glancing over his shoulder at Alex, Tom raised his brows. His brother shook his head and mouthed, "Later," then banged the spoon he'd been using on the rim of the pot of what smelled like chili and replaced the lid. "Another half an hour, I reckon." "Sounds good," Tom replied, tamping down his growing sense of unease. It wasn't completely unheard of for his brother to drop by unannounced, but he was more likely to be found messing around on the PlayStation with Max rather than doing something useful. Alex's idea of domestication had always left a lot to be desired, even when he and Joe had still been together. After the explosive destruction of his marriage 18 months back, Alex had survived the first year of being single by writing and anonymously publishing an excoriating account of his wife's betrayal, which became a runaway bestseller. The stress of keeping his identity quiet, as well as pressure from his publisher to produce a follow-up book, had turned Alex into a takeaway-eating slob. An image of the last time he'd been to Alex's flat came to mind, and Tom dismissed it with a quick shudder as he looked his younger brother over. Though he still sported the terrible post-breakup beard he'd been cultivating, his clothes were clean and smart. A far cry from the sweatpants and stained T-shirts that had become his recent outfit of choice. Something was most definitely up. Giving Max's shoulder a quick squeeze, Tom released it and crossed over towards the pastel blue Smeg fridge. How he'd ever let Anna talk him into the ridiculous-looking thing, and all the other matching small appliances. Shaking his head to chase away the thought before it could take root, he tugged open the door and reached for a couple of bottles of Heineken from the top shelf. "Beer?" He offered one to his brother. "Cheers." Alex took the bottle and retreated back to his spot beside the oven. Want a drink, Max? Max finally looked up, a hint of his usual cheeky smile lighting up his face.
Can I have a beer?
Nice try. Tom twisted the cap off a carton of apple juice and poured some into a glass. He set the drink down in front of Max, then pointed to his textbook. Why don't you take that upstairs and finish off, and we'll give you a shout when dinner's ready? Max folded the book closed, gathered his stuff under one arm and stood. His expression a serious mask once more. He cast a quick glance towards his uncle. It wasn't my fault. It'll be all right, Maxie, Alex said, sending another warning glance towards Tom, who shut his mouth against his better judgment. Take your drink now. When Max looked his way, Tom forced an encouraging smile. Let Em know dinner will be ready in about half an hour. With a little nod, Max traipsed from the kitchen. Tom gave him a count of 5 seconds before he shoved the kitchen door closed behind him and rounded on his brother. What the bloody hell is going on? Alex took a sip from his beer like he had all the time in the world. The school called me. He took another sip. At about 1:30. 1:30? Tom checked his watch. That was 5 hours ago. Yup. Grinding his teeth, Tom tried again. Why did they call you? Alex set his beer down, then folded his arms across his chest. I don't know, Tom. Why did they call me? Is it perhaps, now stay with me here, because you didn't answer your phone? I didn't get any messages. Tom reached into his pocket, letting out a soft curse when he pulled out his work phone. He'd put his personal phone in his medical bag before starting surgery and forgotten all about it. He yanked open the kitchen door and ran towards his study. Come on, he muttered when he messed up the combination on his cabinet lock the first time. By the time he'd got the drawer open and his phone out of his bag, Alex had followed him into the study and closed the door behind him. Tom showed the display full of missed call notifications and urgent text to call the school to his brother. I didn't hear it. With a sick feeling in his stomach, he checked the button on the side of the handset. Shit. I'd put it into silent mode. Never mind about that. Luckily enough, I was at a loose end today, for a change. There was no mistaking the sarcasm lacing Alex's tone, and Tom winced, knowing it was aimed inwards and not at him. Poor Alex had been struggling for months now, and he'd been meaning to check in with him. Tom sank down into his chair. He'd been meaning to do a lot of things, and dropping the ball on all of them. If only Anna was here to help. 3 years, and the wistful, painful, pointless need for her hadn't lessened one bit. Alex set the beer he'd retrieved from the kitchen on the desk and took the seat opposite him. Max had his phone confiscated for looking at... Now, how did Mrs. Henderson put it? He tapped a finger against his lips. Inappropriate images. Oh, Christ. Tom grabbed for his beer and took a gulp. Porn, you mean? How the hell did he break the settings on his account? He knew it was only natural for boys to be curious about such things. Hell, their dad had found a dirty magazine under Tom's bed once, although he'd been a few years older than Max was now, leading to the most embarrassing conversation of both their lives. But the stuff he'd had access to then was so much tamer than the horrendous hardcore images plastered all over the internet these days. Not exactly. Alex pulled a face. Some of the older girls have been persuaded to share selfies, and... When he hesitated, Tom went cold all over. Not Em, he whispered hoarsely. I'm sorry, Tom. Apparently it started as a dare between a few of the girls, and things got out of hand. One of the boys in Emily's class got hold of them somehow, and he sent them to all his mates. They were all around the school in no time. They got sent to Max as part of a group message, and he almost got in a fight when he recognised Em in amongst the photos. That's how his teacher found out about it, and he got sent to the head. Tom leapt to his feet, equal parts furious with and devastated for his daughter. He made it as far as the study door before Alex restrained him with a tight hand around his upper arm. Don't, Tom. When he tried to shake Alex off, his grip tightened. You need to calm down. Calm down. Tom spun on his brother, shoving him back a couple of steps, his anger grateful for a close target. There are nude pictures of my little girl circulating the school and God knows where at this point, and you want me to bloody calm down? He swallowed a sudden rush of bile. Christ, what had Max seen? Alex raised his hands in a placating gesture. Not nudes from what I managed to get the kids to tell me earlier. She's in her underwear. Like that makes it any better, Tom exploded. The desire to lash out, to strike down anything and everything washed over him in a hot wave. He'd never been a violent man. Even shoving his brother was several steps too far. Horrified by his lack of control, Tom whirled away. He needed to put as much distance between himself and Alex as possible, not easy in his little matchbox of a study. Keeping his back to his brother, Tom braced his hands on the wall, pushing against the hard surface as though he could force his anger out through his fingers and into the solid plaster and brick. She's my little girl, Allie. His voice cracked on the last word, a long-forgotten name he'd used when he'd been a teenager himself and Alex a toddler. Though his relationship with his father after he'd divorced Tom's mother Belinda had been difficult, he'd never let his antipathy for the man influence his feelings for his much younger brother. It was impossible not to love Alex. He'd been born with a natural charm, and Tom had been the first of many Alex had wrapped around his finger. A tentative hand patted his shoulder. You're about 5 hours behind exactly where I was, Tommy. The head teacher had to lock her office door until I calmed down enough to agree to bring the kids straight home and not go hunting for those little shits. Tom turned to face his brother, seeing his own righteous fury reflected back in hazel eyes turned to flint. Knowing he wasn't alone in this nightmare, that Alex was there to back him up, helped him regain control of his temper. I'm sorry. He dragged a deep breath into his lungs, fighting past the claw of emotion squeezing everything in his chest tight. How is she? Alex retreated to his chair, picked up his beer and took a long drink before replying. Heartbroken? Confused? Terrified? He made a point of looking Tom square in the eye as he said the last word, and Tom felt the look like a punch in the chest. Of me? He could barely get the question out, the mere idea of it making him want to retch. Of your reaction, of letting you down? Alex scrubbed a hand over his eyes. She's utterly broken up about it, Tom, and I know things haven't been great between the two of you since, well, for a while. Since Anna died, he'd been about to say. Only he didn't. No one even said her name to him, Tom realised with a sick ache in his stomach. He'd turned Anna into a ghost, even around his closest family, even around the children. There was no accusation in Alex's tone, but there didn't need to be. Tom carried enough guilt over the chasm between him and his eldest child to bury a mountain. I should go and talk to Emily. Although he had no idea where he was going to start. Sorry would be a bloody good opener, though. Sorry for what she'd been put through today. Even more sorry for how much harder he'd made things for her with the selfishness of his own grief. He reached for the door handle, but before he could turn it, Alex was on his feet once more. Give it another few minutes. You can't go and talk to her until you're sure you can be calm about it. Alex pointed towards the other chair. Sit down and finish your beer. Tom didn't think it would do any good, but he sat anyway. He could sit for 5 minutes, for 5 days, for 5 years, and he didn't think he could be calm about what he'd learnt in the last few minutes. Ignoring his beer, he reached for his phone and scrolled through the messages and emails from the school. The latest one had come in a few minutes previously, asking Tom to call Mrs. Henderson regardless of the hour. He flicked to her name in his contacts and pressed the call button, switching the phone to speaker mode and setting it on the desk in front of him so Alex could hear both sides. Moira Henderson? Mrs. Henderson, it's Tom Nelson. I'm so sorry not to have contacted you sooner. My phone was on silent mode. No excuse, I know. Good evening, Dr. Nelson. She sounded weary, stressed, and a little sad, and Tom could relate in bucket loads. How is Emily? He hesitated for a moment, then said, "She's in her room. My brother has been catching me up on things, and I thought it best to talk to you and have all the facts at hand before I speak to her myself." Mrs. Henderson sighed. "It's a dreadful situation. My heart goes out to the poor girls involved." Tom had always found the head teacher to be a sensible, level-headed woman, and his admiration for her only increased as she said those words. "I'm still trying to get to the bottom of it, but there appear to be 2 or 3 ringleaders who've pressured the other girls into getting involved." Tom shared a quick glance with Alex. "Do you know how many girls are affected?" 14 so far. Nearly every girl in Emily's house group, and a few from other classes in the same year. I've got a horrible feeling there might be more." "Jesus," Alex blurted out, before clapping a hand over his mouth. Tom gave him a look. "Sorry about that. Alex is here with me." A humorless laugh echoed from the phone. "Don't worry, I've said and thought worse in the past few hours. Look, it's only a few days to the end of term, so we've decided to exercise some flexibility across the whole of Year 10 while we continue our investigation and get to the bottom of things. We've issued a handful of suspensions, but please be reassured that Emily isn't one of them." "What about Max? I'm still not clear on his involvement in all this." "Poor Max," Mrs. Henderson sighed. "He did rather bear the brunt of things because he was the one caught with the offending material in the first place. He was beside himself with worry about getting Emily into trouble. His phone is locked away in my desk. I meant to return it to him before your brother took him and Emily home, but things had escalated by that point and it slipped my mind. I suggest you have a good talk with him, but there won't be any further punishment on our part." "That's some small comfort. And of course I'll have a talk with him." Alex said something about him getting a group text with the photos in it. Another sigh. "One of those WhatsApp group chats, I'm afraid. We do our best, but it's impossible to police these things. Understandably, there are some girls who don't want to come back into school. Although we would strongly encourage them all to attend, we won't report any absence. With the support of my teaching staff, we're going to run quiet sessions in the library for anyone who doesn't feel comfortable sitting in their normal classes. I've spoken to the external mental health support team, and they're making someone available for the students involved to talk to, if they wish. It will be by appointment and entirely confidential. We're also going to run some workshops with Miss Walker, who is our in-house RHSE lead across all the year groups, and we'll be particularly focusing on social media, body autonomy, and consent." He exchanged another quick look with Alex, not sure if he should be relieved or worried about how seriously the school was taking it. Alex gave him a cautious thumbs up, and he nodded. Better it was tackled properly, and it seemed like they were using it as a teachable moment rather than seeking to ostracize or punish the girls involved. "Sounds like you've got everything in hand. Look, I'd better go and see Emily and find out how she's coping with all this. Do let me know if there's anything I can do to help. I'm going to contact my locum service and arrange cover for the rest of the week, so I'll be around." As he should have been from the start, rather than trying to play catch-up. "Thank you. I'll be sending out an email later this evening or early tomorrow morning with details on the arrangements we've made for the rest of the term. Do send Emily my best, and tell her we're here to help." Tom found himself nodding, even though she couldn't see him. "Thanks, Mrs. Henderson. Take care. Good night, Dr. Nelson." And with that she ended the call. Tom sat back in his seat and regarded his brother. What a mess. "You're not wrong," Alex agreed. "Hey, I think the locum thing is a great idea. And if you want me to stick around so you can focus on Emily, I'm happy to keep Max occupied, take him to school, whatever after-school stuff he's got. Just say the word. Poor kid's had a bit of a shock, so I can have a quiet chat with him when it's just the two of us, and you can concentrate on Em." Relief flooded through Tom's veins. "You're sure you don't mind?" Alex shrugged. "I've got nothing else going on." It was on the tip of Tom's tongue to raise the issue of Alex's next book, or rather what appeared to still be a lack of Alex's next book, but that could wait. Perhaps if Alex stayed with them, he'd find a quiet moment in the next few days.
Spare room's made up, and I can loan you whatever you need this evening. Perfect. I'll shoot home in the morning after I drop Max off and chuck some things in a bag. Look, you go and see Emily and I'll check on dinner. I'll put some rice on and get Max fed. You guys can heat some up later. Sounds like a plan.
Tom pushed to his feet, weary to his bones. The weight of the loss of Anna a stone in his gut. She would have known what to do, the right words to say. Her natural warmth and empathetic nature had drawn everyone to her, Tom included, even though once he'd worked his way into the fringes of her orbit during their first year at university, he'd been hopelessly tongue-tied.